Hello and welcome to Leadership Up Close. I'm Anne Lucas, the founder of Alta, and in each episode, I have a candid conversation with an impactful leader in Europe's tech landscape. They've got the t-shirt, they've got the scars, and they're here to share their insights and maybe even their secret sauce.
The best way I've found to align those two is to talk about the customer. But what's different is the speed. It's almost on a weekly basis. You have innovation, you have cost changes on a weekly basis. And that's the crazy part. That's hard for leadership to be comfortable with, putting money somewhere and it doesn't work. That's part of the process. That's difficult. So that you need to be very strict on making sure that there is kind of this blameless culture.
Today, we're diving into a theme that sits right at the intersection of technology and leadership. From transformation to AI governance, how do leaders and boards stay ahead in a new cycle? My guest, Renaud Bruyeron, has led through every kind of change, IPOs, mergers, acquisitions, and major technological shifts. We'll explore what these cycles have taught him about leading at scale and how the AI era is now reshaping leadership, governance, and the skills we need next. Let me tell you a little bit about Renaud. So Renaud is a tech leader with more than 25 years experience, shaping some of Europe's biggest marketplace platforms. He's led global product and engineering teams of over 2,500 people. Yes, 2,500 through every phase of the journey, from hypergrowth to IPO, merger, and private equity transformation. Renaud played a key role in a 6 billion carve-out and IPO, a 9 billion acquisition integration, and a massive cloud transformation, moving 3,000 services and closing 4 data centers. From Leboncoin to Schibsted and Adevinta, he has seen firsthand how big digital businesses keep reinventing themselves and what it takes for leaders to stay ahead with constant change. But Renaud, I'll let you introduce yourself briefly before we dive into today's topic.
Thank you, Anne. I don't know what else there is to say. I'm French. Sure. I'm French educated. I'm an engineer. I come from the technology. That's what I do, what I've been doing for 25 years. But of course, I've done it in different capacity. Early on, very hands-on. I was doing the angle brackets in websites. When I started out, it was the early times of the web in the late 90s, early 2000s in a web agency. And then, as you said, I went to Leboncoin. In 2013, I led, it was a startup at the time, but a very successful one. It kind of redefined its industry, which is the classifieds, then became marketplace. That was part of Adevinta and Schibsted. And so then I moved to corporate roles. So my role changed multiple times, from really hands-on, I was coding myself, to then leading a tech team in a startup, to then at corporate with larger teams, much larger teams in multiple countries. So I went through many changes, and as the industry itself transformed itself through mergers, acquisitions, IPOs, and now private equity also entering in the game. So a lot of changes are going through. And AI, because it's a product and technology game, this industry, it's all about software. Half the staff was software engineers in this company. It's the same for our peers. Of course, AI is a big change. We had the mobile revolution. It was web-based originally, then mobile, then the cloud changed many things. And now we're in the midst of this AI revolution. It's going to impact all industries, especially the ones that are software-based, like classifieds and marketplaces.
Thank you for that. And we'll dive into that into a second. And you've mentioned many, many changes. And the aim of this interview series actually is to talk about how, as leaders, you drive impact, and impact in, hypergrowth, in merger and integration, when you're leading product engineering, that means different things. So let's just start at the beginning a little bit, because I think this is really quite unique. You started your career at W3C, literally at the heart of the web's creation with Tim Berners-Lee, which is just amazing. How did that shape your view of technology and innovation?
Yeah, so I was a bit lucky. I was a young graduate and I had my military service to do for France, because that's the way you did it. And I was very lucky. I had the opportunity to do it at the W3C in Boston. What I came out of graduate school. I was in the university system. For me, science, academics, it was all there was, right? This was my worldview. And there it was full of academics. The W3C is driven internally by experts and people that come from an academic background, but it's a consortium partnering with the industry to drive those standards. And I realized that there's a lot more than, science to it, that also commercial interests are very powerful. And when I joined there, it was the first browser war. Netscape and Microsoft were fighting for leadership. So it was very interesting to see that team of academics working with their colleagues in the industry to try to steer the standards in an open way, even though there was a big fight out there for leadership on something that was going to be huge, right? It was the beginning of the web, really. So it was very interesting it kind of opened my mind on, okay, this is not just science. It's not always science that is right. You have to consider many different things, and you have to work with everyone, which was the principle at B2C. So collaboration was huge.
Did you know at the time that you were part of something really special that was going to define, the future of technology?
It was probably difficult for me no, I did not really realize. I was 21, 22, so I was super young and I was having fun. It was a lot of fun, but I did not quite realize I could see that this would change a lot of things. But for me, it was mostly exciting. I was having fun. And so I was not really thinking, what does this mean for the world or those kind of things. I was just having fun, doing something super interesting, working with great people. But I could see this was important, yes, because very powerful companies were involved and wanted to be involved. It was very important to them. So this was, it was quite obvious that this was big.
Okay. The benefit of hindsight. Now we know where it was. And obviously you went from very hands-on engineer to CTO and then CPTO or CTPO, correct me if I'm wrong. What did you have to learn or unlearn in that journey?
Yes, I think, the biggest change and the obvious one is that you let go of the code, right? And when you're an engineer, you're deep into the actual matter, and this is what you produce. You produce code, and as you grow, all the way to CTO, your impact is not defined by your own code, but more, what is your impact outside of what you actually produce yourself. So that's the biggest change. But for engineers like me who really love the content, what we were producing, this is a hard change, and it was a struggle. It's a struggle for most of my peers who've been through that change. Is at some point they have to let go. They cannot continue to be the best engineer or the best coder. They have to accept that no, they have to do something else. They have to have impact in a different way because they can, and they're being asked to. And usually this means letting go of the code, having impact through others, influencing your peers, influencing your colleagues that are coding as well, but also leadership. And this is the biggest change, I would say. Not as hands-on, not as close to the details, and much more high-level way of having impact. But if you let go of the details, you let go of the control. So then you have to learn to trust others, to influence them, to steer them, then making sure the direction is clear for everyone, that there is a clear line of sight for everyone involved. That's effectively what becoming a leader means.
I know you're a hands-on and technical CTO, which is hard to imagine when you're leading thousands of people. What's the difference then between being a hands-on CTO in that kind of organization? What does that mean? How do you stay hands-on when you're leading so many people?
The closest to the technical work was when there was a problem at a high level and you had to whiteboard solutions with, architects or senior engineers, but usually they have the technical solutions. The problem is finding the trade-offs between, technical solutions, technical opportunities, and other considerations like, and we'll talk about this later, guardrails, security, compliance, and other factors that are driving the business. And that's where, as a leader, you bring that whole view and kind of whiteboard this. But this was the closest to hands-on. At this stage, I do not actually put my hands in the code. That would be actually probably wrong because I'm not I'm not able to operate at that level that our expert individual contributors can now with the code. So my job is different.
Okay, but able to guide people to make sure that they can deliver the right technical solutions and speaking coding in the right way.
Yeah, and understand the trade-offs. Because that's the part it's like opening the context and say, hey, this is a whole context, not just that. This is a whole context, and then find the solution from there. So that's the role.
And then of course it's different if you're in hypergrowth and you're building to then if you're transforming, how do you then lead and manage that shift from being the CTO in hypergrowth? You're building something, a platform that makes sense for that one business. Then you've got, merger, integration, you're having to work with different teams. How does that impact you as a CTO in a way you manage your organization and transformation?
Yes, I think so. Hypergrowth is kind of it's both very complicated because a lot of the systems become like the governance systems become obsolete very quickly as you go through the stages because you have scale problems. You have to introduce management layers. You have to change the way you organize because of growth. But at the same time, when you're in hypergrowth, you're successful, everything is good. It's almost like you can make mistakes, but it doesn't matter. It's going to get eaten up by the growth. So in some way, it's more forgiving. In other ways, it's more challenging because you have to deal with change. You have to deal with scaling effects that you have to solve. When you go into big changes, whether they're due to restructuring because the business is not doing so well, or happy events like an IPO or an acquisition. But that's quite different because sometimes you cannot absorb mistakes, right? You have to be careful because this is very impactful to many people, many businesses, usually when this happens. So then your level of involvement in risk management becomes bigger. Mm-hmm. But then when you're in a hypergrowth where it's kind of like you're trying to keep the rocket on target, but the rocket is going up no matter what, right? Mm-hmm. So it feels that way sometimes. But of course, you know that you have to change the way the system operates because of scale effects.
And, I always think about transformation is a little bit like building the plane in full flight, or having to rebuild the plane in full flight. There's no such thing as we're going to park the plane, we're going to rebuild it nicely on the ground for 12 months, 18 months, and then we put it back into action. How do you manage your stakeholders, whether it's on the business side or the product side or the commercial? How do you manage expectations?
Yes, I think you have two stakeholders, right? You have the business is asking for things, and then you have your the developers, the teams that are kind of trying to protect the technology from losing its shape and losing its integrity. So you have safety and control versus, yes, but growth. We need to go after opportunities, and you have to find a balance. And usually the best way I've found to align those two is to talk about the customer. Like, what are we trying to do? So go back to the fundamentals of what are we trying to do? And usually what I've seen, and it's always worked this way, is teams that build the things, the engineers, if you bring them close to the customers, they do understand what's at stake. They do understand what is needed, and they can make the trade-offs, right? It's much harder if you try to be someone in the middle and make the trade-offs and you don't understand what's in the engine room and you don't understand what the customer wants. The best way to do this is cross-functional teams, because usually they find the trade-offs. Then what you need to do is make that happen, which is of course not so easy, but organize things so that the team talk together and you can find this balance between the growth at all costs and keeping the system's integrity safe so that, the business can be sustainable and survive that growth. So it's worked. Of course, you need to hire the right people. You need to have the right engineers. But if people are really believing what they're doing, which goes back to the vision and the purpose, then usually if they look at customer problems, then they find a way to solve those while keeping the systems and find the trade-offs. Perfect. It's very difficult for a leader to try to solve all of this. So you have to find a way to involve everyone. And so I think cross-functional teams looking at user problems, that's the best way to keep clarity.
And it's of all the phases that you've been through, IPO, hypergrowth, etc. What's been, would you say, the most challenging for you as a leader of technology?
I think the big merger, like merging two companies, two cultures, two ways of working, two technologies, in multiple countries, that was difficult. Yes, I think even compared to an IPO, the IPO that we went through was complicated system-wise, but it was very clear. It was a happy event. It was an ambition. There was a lot of ambition, a lot of growth. Everyone is in it. But the merger is always difficult because people understand that changes will happen. You're turning something different, and so they have to change. So the merger, I think, is more challenging. It's more difficult because it's very hard to have very clear answers early on. Like it takes a while, even for leadership, to figure out, exactly, okay, this is the sum of the parts. This is where we're going to take it. It takes a while, and that period where it's a bit unclear is challenging for the teams. I found that this was challenging because they would ask questions like, what's going to happen to us? What does this mean for the thing I do? Because I know another team over there is doing it as well. And so all these things create that period needs to be as short as possible. So I think the merger is harder for that reason.
How long did that take, would you say, roughly?
I think the merger, the complete integration plan was 3 years, right? It was the total company was, the result of the merger was a 6,000 people company, 6,000. So it was big. It took about 3 years, but of course the first year is the hard one. Because that's where you have the certainty, the design and the shape and the direction you want to take things. And then once you're able to explain this clearly, then the next two are more about the execution. And of course, there are challenges there, but it's not as hard as the first part where there's always a bit of uncertainty.
And just for the benefit of our listeners, so you're talking about the mergers of eBay classifieds into what was Schibsted, essentially, right?
Exactly. It was Adevinta buying the classifieds business from eBay called eBay Classifieds Group. And on the financial was Adevinta was buying, but practically these were almost equal size. So it was a murder. It looked like a murder. And so, yeah, I remember that period was challenging. It was very complex, very big. A lot of similarities. Luckily, culturally, there were a lot of similarities. So the cultures were not at hand out. So that made things a lot easier. I don't know what that looks like when the cultures are radically different. That would probably make the process much harder.
What would you say was, you mentioned a sort of 3-year integration plan. So there's a plan, but how much of it did you have to then kind of scrap away and iterate as you went along a little bit, or did you find you were actually sticking to a plan?
It's a good question. If I remember on, I think the technology side, I think we probably completed 80% of the plan, and some of the 20% we didn't do were probably forecasting errors or estimates errors. So we assumed some things could be simplified, and we realized it could not. It was not so simple. But most of the big transformations we executed.
And at some point, you also took on the product remit. How did that feel like? Does that make sense today in a business to have product and tech under one leader?
Yeah, I think there are two schools of thought. I don't think there's a right one. I think it depends. First of all, it depends on the size. I think if you're in a startup and scale up, probably having those roles separated makes sense because there's a tension there that's necessary. And what we did at Adevinta when we joined up those two roles was more at the executive team level. That's where we joined it because it's very hard to find two different leaders and talent for those type of roles. But down the organization design, there was a point where we did split the roles. We made that a rule. We said, no, there we need to have two different individuals, all those roles. So it was possible to join up at leadership level. But I think when we drew the line was managers of managers. So there we separated the two roles. We said, no, you do need to have those two. It's very difficult for one person to do both. Very, very unusual.
And as you said, there's a different school of thought. I think there was a bit of a trend to have CTPO, CPTO, and I think we're now going back to let's separate them a little bit. But I agree with you. I think it's sort of depends on the business, what they're going through. Is it a product-led business? Particularly if you're in a founder-led business, it depends on the sort of the profile of the founders. If one of them is naturally a product leader or a tech leader, then it defines a little bit what you're going to structure in the organization.
I think also senior leadership talent in product in Europe was a bit rarer a few years ago. I mean, these roles kind of created in the US. In the US, much more common. So I don't know the stats, but I think in Europe it was harder to find senior product leadership versus senior technical leadership.
I can tell you to find senior product leaders in Europe, even recently, 5 years ago, I would say, because as you said, it was very much a US thing, and the US was so far advanced. There was definitely a huge pool of talent, and it's just sort of a different scale. It was actually about 5 years ago, it was really hard to find people who had 10 years of product leadership in a kind of a modern SaaS because it just didn't exist. It's changed a lot. I think in the last 3 or 4 years, it's really sort of gone up a level or two. But yes, still quite challenging to have, particularly at scale. So you've lived through several waves of disruption. As we said, we started at the heart of the internet creation, and we're now entering the AI era. Let's talk about this one because it feels a little bit different. So when you look at AI's acceleration, how does it compare with the digital and the cloud shifts that we've previously led?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and we keep talking about this with colleagues and my friends in the industry and say, hey, what's different about this one? I think that first we can start with what's similar, right? I think if I compare, there are like 3 things I like to compare. One is the web itself in early 2000s, then the mobile revolution. Let's not forget about that one. 2010. Then concurrently behind the scene, you had the cloud, right? So you can compare with this. I think web and mobile. What's common with AI is that there's kind of a game-breaking change in ability for the users. The usage patterns that evolve. Users are learning to chat with GPTs, and the usage levels are crazy right now, so faster than anything we've seen before in terms of usage from people like you and me, individuals. So that's one hand side. And then when it comes to the web and clouds compared to AI, there's another aspect, which is unit economics change, like a game-breaking change in, with the cloud, it was, compute and storage costs went down, dropped like a rock. And so it then made things possible that previously were not feasible. financially, they didn't make sense. Same thing for the web, where the cost, if you remember, the web exploded when the cost of bandwidth went down. Like everyone could have a DSL. That's when it exploded, right? So it was actually unit economics that drove the growth. So you have those two things combined with AI, because you have a change in patterns. Users are like finding this super useful, and the cost of the token is crashing. It's an exponential, growth in how many tokens you can buy per dollar. And so you have those two things happening at the same time. And then what's different? So those two things are common to the previous revolutions, but what's different is the speed. It's almost on a weekly basis. You have innovation, you have cost changes on a weekly basis. And that's the crazy part. That's what makes this very unusual. You have game-breaking changes in ability, game-breaking changes in cost, and then in terms of innovation speed, and linked to this, the capital that's being invested in this, it looks like orders of magnitude bigger than before. So that's really the biggest difference. That what makes it very challenging for leaders and boards and investors to read what's going on, because the science is moving and the application of it is trying to catch up, but it's very hard to follow. So I think that's there are commonalities we can learn from those, but at the same time, we've never seen a change happening this fast.
And as you said, it's challenging for leadership teams right now. But how much is it understanding the technology itself versus grasping its strategic and cultural implications? Because there is that, isn't it? There's also applying a real understanding the technical part of AI. How do you put that into practice versus the strategic, the business transformation? How challenging is that for leadership teams from what you've seen?
It's very challenging. I think the conversations I have with business leaders who are not deep into the technology, it feels like there's a lot of uncertainty and unclarity on what is really possible and what is going to happen. So it's a little bit like navigating a fog, and there are gremlins, and there are monsters, but you also know there's an opportunity. And so I think, yes, the lack of understanding, not maybe, at the level, not like, okay, what does the transformer architecture mean? How does an LLM work? You don't need to know this, but you at least need to know how people are going to work with these pieces of technology. The same way as before the digital revolution, leaders and boards need to understand how software gets made. So not just, you don't need to understand Python or Java, but you need to understand how engineering teams work and what the constraints are, how fast it can go, what's the cost of a mistake. And when it comes to AI, everything is out the window in terms of benchmarks. And so for leaders, boards, investors, it is very hard to understand how you set things up properly to then use AI as an opportunity and not, be left behind. So understanding how your teams are going to work with it, understanding what it means for software teams, how much this is going to change their work, and understanding what this means for risk, compliance, privacy, not at the deep level, but at the strategic level. There's many things that are impacted, and lack of clarity, I think, for business leaders on how to take the first step forward. But at the core, there's lack of understanding of what an LLM does or can do. Right. So there's a bit of like a magic box, a black box effect. And without going into the science, I think it's important to increase that literacy at leadership level to understand LLM can do some things really well, but also other things very poorly. And therefore, this is quite different from, other technologies we've seen before. And you need to adapt the way you work. And this is still lacking today.
And I mean, I'd love your perspective as a technology leader, how it felt, as recent as just a few months ago, that there was a lot of chasing the hype versus moving wisely. Do you feel that we are now at a point where, companies and leaders and founders out there have kind of taken a bit of a step back and thought, okay, how do we move wisely versus let's just make sure that we've got an AI solution. Let's make sure the investors are happy we're chasing the hype and we've got AI, but is it the wise kind of AI application?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. I think there was huge pressure from investors, boards, on investors, on the boards, and therefore on the executive teams to have answers. Right, a few months ago, and we're like, "Hey, what are you doing? You're not doing anything. Then that's unacceptable. Me too." And so everyone was kind of running around. And what was unusual this time is that there was resistance from the teams themselves that previously embraced, especially technical teams, embraced technology innovation before cloud, mobile, all these. On this one, they're like themselves worried. They're worried because everyone they're reading in the newspapers, so you're going to be out of the job soon, which personally I don't believe is true, right? But this is what they hear. And so they don't know they're being asked to innovate and say, hey, you have to use it. You have to invent new things. And they're worried and say, but so what? What's going to happen to me? No answers. And so executive teams were stuck between investors applying pressure because if investors are worried about missing out, and then their teams start saying, wait a minute, what does this mean? No one has the answer, especially not the executive team, because they're looking for answers. So this was a situation probably a few months ago. Things have evolved quite a bit. There's now a fair bit of industry analysis that shows actually companies that did not have a clear plan, that did not have a structured process to figure out what use cases you go after and so on, usually failed. Usually did not work out well. Usually they're I call them laptop experiments, which are super impressive. But then turning this into a revenue generating, compliant and safe system, that's quite a big gap. And so I think moving from laptop experiment to something with proven ROI has proved much more difficult. And so now there's a little bit more, okay, wait a minute. How do we do this actually in a structured way? So companies are going back on, what are the fundamentals that need to be in place? And you need to have fundamentals. It's not a magic thing that you put. No, if you don't have control over your data, if you don't have, good talent in data, then the magic box is not going to do anything. And especially you're not going to create a competitive advantage because everyone can use the magic box. So you have to have control of your data. You have to have the talent that understands how to plug this in, how to implement guardrails and compliance in this, and how to then make it production worthy. So something that you can rely on, that's not going to hallucinate, that's not going to tell the wrong thing to your customers. That takes time, that takes effort, and it takes money as well. And therefore, you need to have prioritization. You cannot do everything. You cannot say your teams, everyone needs to do AI. So the companies that do well usually have this reflex of, do we have the fundamentals? Data is important. So companies that are well advanced in their digital transformation, usually they have control over the data, they have centralized it, they have governance, they understand where it comes from, they understand the compliance landscape, and they have the talent to use it. And then they have a structured process. They say, what are the use cases? What's our strategy? Let's go back to our customers. What's the most valuable use case in there? And then we have experts that say, yes, AI is relevant there. It's relevant there. It's not relevant there yet. Let's start with the first one. That's the most valuable.
Roadmap of an application for customer solutions. And it's interesting because what I'm seeing a lot at the moment is particularly in scale businesses, if they've got, different subsidiaries, different business units, where if they have to go through an AI transformation, in a sense, again, you're having to go through a technology transformation, applying best practices and ways of working, but also cultural transformations. What I'm seeing, and I'd love your perspective on that, is, top C-level talent, CTOs, who have been more at the strategic end of leadership for the last few years, who are having to then go back to something that's actually, well, the best way of describing it is a bit of a helicopter role, where you're having to be working with the board, working with leaders and CEOs on, okay, what does AI transformation mean, to your point? What's the roadmap? What's the how? What are we building? How does it make sense for the market and for our customers, to then going quite deep into the organization to make sure that the best practices are there, to we're building the right products. That's what I'm seeing. Are you noticing that as well?
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. You're right. The helicopter view, the role, the board, the leadership, the executive team, and the next line, they need to get to a level of an understanding that's enough to be able to then have productive conversations with ML experts, data scientists, and so on, the most important things we need to do with the business or with our customers are these 10 things or these 5 things. 5 is better. Where is AI relevant? And of course, they need to have access to the experts that will say, yes, here you can do it this way, this way. They need to develop that intuition themselves and then say, okay, then it's going to be, we're not going to do everything. We're going to do 1, 2, 3. And they need to develop that. And then they're going to find that, what is a bit unusual this time is that there is this resistance that where I talked about in the teams on the floor. And so you have to get over this. So I think that's a little bit new, and the leadership needs to then come down to the floor and understand a bit more, what does this mean day to day? Like, what are we going to do? What's missing? What are the blockers? What are the fears? But at least if you have that structured view of, these are the priorities, you can bring that clarity to the teams and remove a little bit that what's going to happen to me. But I think, yes, you have to do both. As you said, I like the helicopter view. You have to be able to survey the field and say, this is the landscape, but you have to develop a bit of literacy, a little bit of understanding on what these systems can do and cannot do, and where the science is headed, what are the unit economics that matter, which are the strategic elements of AI. This you need to learn. And so, it doesn't matter. Either you have people internally that can tell you, or you need to hire advisors that kind of raise the literacy there, but you need to have some sense of this to be able to make calls on the priorities.
So that means AI transformation is as much a business transformation as a technology transformation. So in your sense, who needs to own that in an organization?
I think the CEO needs to own this. I think the CEO needs the executive team, if not the CEO, it's someone in the exec team, but it has to be on the agenda at the top level. It needs to be structured. There needs to be board support. So the board itself needs to also get an understanding and can help as well. But it needs to be on the agenda of the executive team. The CEO needs to make sure there is progress. So I think it needs to be at that level, but it cannot be what I've seen before, what technology are we going to use? I want to understand which partner we're going to select, or it's not a technology problem. It's not, right? There's a lot of choice now. It's a transformation. It's going to change the way you do business, the way you solve the use cases that are most important to the company. Then focus on that. Which one do you take first? How do you set things up so that the teams can work on them and bring answers and learn how to do it? The same way we did machine learning, 10 years ago when we were first companies were learning to do it, they were learning to do it. And new rules were created, rules that did not exist before. That process cannot happen in the boardroom or the executive leadership room. It needs to happen in the teams by experimenting, learning, making mistakes. But for the teams to be able to do this, there needs to be clarity on the priorities.
And what about the ethics of AI? How do boards and leaders, how do they need to address that to make sure that there is a framework for ethical AI as is being used in an organization?
Yes, that's a very interesting, slightly beyond my kind of expertise, right? But I think with AI, I think one of the things that's a little bit misunderstood sometimes is that AI is going to challenge mightily rules-based systems, rules-based governance, especially because AI, the revolution is generative AI, right? Which is a subset. It's highly statistical, probabilistic. So rule-based systems, you can automate rule-based systems with AI, but if you have a system of governance in your company that's really rules-based, it's going to be challenged by this. So I think companies that have a more principle-based system of governance, where you have guardrails instead of hard rules, systems of rules, are going to be able to maneuver the space because it's moving very fast. So I think that's probably one of the things that I remember from my time in Adevinta. We were always trying to go back to principles instead of, what are the rules? Like, show me the list of rules. And I was like, what are the guiding principles? By doing this, you give more autonomy, more freedom, more leeway for the teams to figure out the trade-offs and the challenges than giving them a book of rules. It's easier said than done. I'm simplifying things, but it's actually very hard, right? To have a principle-based governance system. For this, you also need a very clear cascading of, strategy, vision, what are the big priorities, down to the teams. Like the teams need to understand what their role is in all this. If they understand what their role is, there are clear principles to guide them when they reach the decision points, then they can move very fast and make progress and staying inside the guardrails, the principles that you want to guide them. And for me, ethics is in this area. Like you translate your ethical framework into principles or guardrails that you can cascade down, and the teams then can operate within that. But that's the way I would try to frame it. But try to implement ethics with, a very rule-based system is going to be very difficult. It's going to slow everything down.
And for you, has this kind of revolution, AI revolution that's happening, has it changed the way you would hire people? Would you look for something different in the talent that you would bring into your team today?
Yes. Let me try to think for this. I think so I think one question, and I've seen this before, is people say, okay, you need CEOs that really understand these things. So you need really hands-on technical CEOs. That's what you need. And the same thing for your leaders. Like everyone needs to be able to code, and if not, they will be lost in this. I think it's a little bit more complicated than this. I think sometimes I like to talk about translators between tech and business. How do you connect the topics? I mentioned before cross-functional teams. So how do you make that happen? It's easy to say, right? But to make it happen, you have to organize in a certain way. And it goes back to culture. It goes back to this principle-based governance systems. It goes back to how you set strategic objectives and making sure this is cascaded into objectives that all the teams understand. They can see, yes, I understand this. This is my thing. I'm the owner of this. I'm going to make progress. So you have to, I think the hiring is not fundamentally going to be different than before. I mean, it's been changing for 10 years, right? We're going more and more towards people who have, IQ is important, but you also have to have EQ. You have to collaborate. You have to work across functions. And AI, I think, is going to accelerate this. I think it's going to be even more important. You have to have engineers that can follow a sales rep on a trip and understand what the customer wants, and then goes back and say, "Wait a minute, I saw this. Let's try it," and have something the next week with the sales rep. So I think you will want that agility, and not keep people in boxes. So I think breaking those barriers between the functions is and this comes from the leaders, but it's also the type of people you hire.
And in your own organization, would you do something different to kind of compartmentalize the AI innovation and transformation, or would you have it integrated within the teams that, as you've done before, maybe?
Yes, I think we've tried both. We've tried to, I remember 10, 15 years ago, we had dedicated data teams that were kind of exploring, but very quickly we realized, first, it's not going to be sustainable. It's probably good if you start from there's no skills or competencies yet. And so you create that small nucleus, but very quickly, your goal will be to break this and spread it into the organization and increase the literacy across the board, increase the awareness, and increase this cross-functional work. I think it's the same for AI. Depending on where you are, if you're already pretty advanced in data usage, data management, and you've been doing ML, machine learning, like old school machine learning for a while, you're probably already equipped with the talent you need. And then you need to continue pushing this into the teams.
And developing the talent that you already have, I take it.
Yes. And focus on disseminating this instead of having this into, resist the temptation of bringing this into a small kind of innovation lab and tell them, hey, run with it, while the others, they keep the business running. This is, it only works for a while you kind of develop the first learnings. But as soon as you have the first learnings, as soon as you have your prioritized use cases, break it up and then stimulate all the teams. Find a way to operate that way.
And do you think we have what it takes in Europe to be, in terms of talent, to be sort of a true competitive force against, the US on one side, China on the other? Do we have the right talent in Europe?
That's a big question. I think the fundamentals is we have good science-based education, we have good business education, and we have systems where we understand we need to mix this. So I think the fundamentals probably are there. Then who's going to take AI leadership globally? That's a much more complicated question. If you look at where the CapEx is going, it's mostly two places. It's China and the US. Does that mean that Europe is going to fall behind? Again, it's quite a complicated question. I think many companies in Europe, and I've seen, in my previous, in Adevinta, where, are able to innovate with these systems and create value, even if, actually the technology LLMs, the frontier LLM research is being done in only a couple or 3 places in the world, but it's also becoming a commodity, just like the cloud was. And so you'll be able to take it off the shelf. What matters is what you do with it and how you do it. And this, I don't think we're in Europe unequipped for this. I think we have talent that can do this.
So,
I'm optimistic. Optimistic.
That's good. That's good to hear. So, Renaud, how do you create a culture that embraces both experimentation, but without losing control?
Yes. So it goes back to, having autonomous teams, but you kind of know what they're doing, right? You need a governance system, and it's the system thing. So, but it's not the only thing, but at least that one you need to have, which is, what's our strategy 3-5 years? How does this translate into objectives? And then how does this translate at crew level, tribe level, team level? And so then the team members, they understand what they have to do and why they need to do it, because they can say, yes, I'm doing It's the old story of, the cleaning man in the corridors of NASA saying, hey, I'm helping putting a man on the moon. It's corny, that story, but it's actually very important. I found that without that line of sight to the overarching objective, it's very hard to have teams that are autonomous and will self-start into solving problems that they see. So that's the first kind of required thing. The second thing that you need is servant leadership. So having leaders, of course, the leaders need to set up that system so that they have line of sight, but then unblocking teams. They're here to unblock teams, bring clarity, restore context when it's missing so that teams understand why they need to do things, right? And then unblock them, because sometimes teams run into blockers. They don't know the trade-offs, like I said before. Expand the context so that they say, now I understand the trade-off. Okay, now I know how to do it. And I think the third thing, and this is very hard, I've noticed it's very hard, is to embrace success. Okay, so this you can do, celebrate success, but also embrace failures. Because if you experiment, you're going to fail. You have to accept it. As leaders, it's hard, right?
Because you're at the edge of innovation, so you have to fail at some point.
You're going to make mistakes. And it's not mistakes, by the way. The first thing is not mistake. Okay, that did not work. That's what happened. Exactly. So it did not work. Why? And, what are the reasons? What did we estimate wrong? And focus on the why, on the what and the how. We did not work rather than the who. So moving to blameless culture and, fostering this, we made a mistake, therefore we're going to learn something. And that's valuable. Right? So how do we do this? That's hard. That's hard for leadership to be comfortable with putting money somewhere and it doesn't work. That's part of the process. That's difficult. And for teams to have teams and managers and the leadership and the hierarchy to create that safe environment where you can try something, you have that freedom to explore and try, but also then sometimes it doesn't work. Well, there's value in this and you will not be blamed for it. That's hard. So you need this. If they don't feel safe experimenting, if they don't feel safe trying things, then they will not do it. They will do what they know will work. And so you will not innovate.
And I guess in that, you also have to get people out of their comfort zone a little bit to make sure that they're not just doing what they've done before, but they feel they have the trust and the support to try different things, to sort of push the boundaries a little bit and to see, well, I might try
and
this.
They will get the recognition. They will get the recognition. They need to see it. So you need to, that's why you need to celebrate success. But you also need to celebrate learnings, so that they have the recognition. They know, I'm going to get recognized for this. And therefore that's a powerful motivator for them to then explore. And then there's of course, the motivator of discovery, right? So especially if you're dealing with engineers, they love to, understand things. So if you say, hey, we would like to understand that, or try this, and there will be game unless they feel unsafe doing it. So that's why it's super important. That's a cultural element. It's hard, especially big organizations, because, sometimes it can be complicated to read things. It can be complicated to understand the goals. There can be politics. Yes. So that you need to be very strict on making sure that there is kind of this blameless culture, focusing on the what and the how, and not on the who.
But in one way, in large organizations, you probably have the slight benefit of having time and money to get your teams to try and experiment on things. But in a hypergrowth or in a startup environment where there's pressure to build quickly, maybe it's naturally a more entrepreneurial environment. So of course you're going to test and learn a little bit, but you don't have the benefit of, there's a runaway.
You have to survive.
You have to survive. You have to survive the next day. There's no time to experiment. There's probably no time for the culture to be as collaborative and positive as what you described. So I can see the challenges in both environments. I could talk to you for hours on this. And I'm glad we touched on that point, because as you said, very rightly, it's a very important point to make sure that you can drive transformation and have the right culture in your teams to do that, with the support of CEO owning and the board supporting the CEO. So it's kind of a yin and yang of everybody having to work together, which can bring in some challenges. So to wrap up, and we'll go into something a bit more fun in a minute, but first of all, you've got 25 years experience. You've been a leader in many different types of organizations and through transformation. What is the one word that would define leadership today? For you, what would that be today?
Change, I think. Change. If I look at the last, at least the last 10 years, so a bit less than 25 years, it's been constant change, and change ability or change agility is a great trait to look for in individual contributors, leaderships, managers, because it's going to continue to change.
Okay.
It's not going to stop. So yeah, I think that would be the main characteristic for me.
Okay. And in a slightly more fun way, a bit of a questionnaire de Proust a little bit, what advice would you give your younger self stepping into leadership for the first time?
Yes, I think that's interesting because it's not so easy as a question, but I think if I look back at my younger self, the first time I had to manage a team, or I think I would tell myself, prioritize helping, like finding a way to help others. So help your teammates, of course, your peers, your boss, but helping, like focusing on how can I help? How can I make things easier? How can I unblock people? And not stress so much about, oh, I have a new set of objectives and I have a new set of responsibilities and and you feel the weight sometimes when you move into those positions. And I would say to my younger self, don't stress so much about this. If you create value, if you help, and helping is a very good way to build trust, build collaboration. It's a very simple thing, but it's very effective. Not I do it because I feel good about it, because it's actually useful. You're going to learn, it's going to have an effect on others, and you're going to be a better leader if you develop that muscle.
And what is a leadership rule you would happily break?
So yeah, the boss gives orders. So this one, that's the old school. I don't think if it's a role, I'm cheating a little bit. I don't think there are many leadership books today that say, you're there to give orders. So I'm cheating slightly, but I think there's a little bit of this, you don't take authority, right? It comes to you. People give you authority because they trust you, because they believe that you're authentic. You don't take it. So it's the other way is true. You don't give orders, right? You work with people so that they make the right decisions, set them up so that they make the right decisions. So I think I'm quite happy to break that rule.
And as you said, more than ever, your role becomes a bit of a buffer because you've got pressure from your teams. You feel their kind of job is being threatened by AI or Gen AI coming in. And then you've got pressure from investors, boards, leaders who put pressure on the tech organizations. You're more than ever kind of the buffer and having to translate between the two. So you can't possibly be sort of top down. If leadership had a soundtrack song, what song would be yours?
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm a bit of a classical music. Huh? It's not maybe the most fun, but I think I would maybe go for Bach. And this is a late stage for me. I was not into that music when I was younger. It's more like the turning structure into beauty. It's very structured, and yet it's incredibly beautiful. So I think for leaders, structure is important. But you can make it not boring. You can make it beautiful and engaging for everyone. So
it's been really fun and insightful talking to you. We could talk for hours. Sadly, we have to end the interview, but it's been a real pleasure. And I can't wait to see what you're going to be doing next. I'm sure there will be transformation involved. There'll be scale and there will be AI involved. So I can't wait to see what that will be.
Thank you, Anne.